Some graves keep the past alive, but some quietly change the future of everyone who stands before them. Every first Saturday of October, I drove the same winding road to the same peaceful cemetery carrying a bouquet of white lilies that never seemed bright enough against the weight of memory. The routine had remained unchanged for 5 years. I parked beneath the old maple trees, walked through rows of weathered headstones, and stopped before the polished granite marker engraved with my son's name. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves, while soft sunlight filtered through branches painted in shades of gold and amber. It was the only place where the world expected nothing from me. No board meetings. No financial reports. No conversations about success. Only silence. I knelt beside the grave, carefully placed the flowers against the stone, and brushed away a few scattered leaves that the autumn wind had left behind. I whispered the same quiet greeting I had spoken every month, believing that somehow my words still mattered even if no answer ever came. Then I noticed something unusual. A few yards away, someone else stood near the grave. A young woman wearing a simple waitress uniform held the hand of a little boy no older than 5. She did not realize I had arrived. Her shoulders trembled as silent tears rolled down her face. The child looked up at her with remarkable patience before reaching into his small pocket and offering her a neatly folded handkerchief. She smiled through her tears, accepted it, and gently thanked him before turning back toward the headstone. Neither of them carried expensive flowers. Instead, the little boy carefully placed a single hand-picked white daisy beside the lilies I had just brought. I remained completely still, uncertain whether to interrupt such a private moment. After several seconds, the young woman quietly noticed me. Surprise crossed her face. She immediately stepped back and lowered her eyes with quiet respect. "I am so sorry," she said softly. "We did not mean to disturb your visit." Her voice carried genuine kindness rather than fear. Before I could answer, the little boy looked directly at me with calm blue eyes that somehow felt strangely familiar. He smiled politely, took the woman's hand again, and together they prepared to leave. Yet neither of them explained why they had come or why they had been crying before my son's grave. I watched them walk toward the cemetery gate until the boy suddenly turned around one last time. He looked back at the headstone, smiled gently, and whispered a single nickname that only my family had ever used for my son. In that instant every breath caught inside my chest, because there was no possible way a stranger could have known those words, and I realized my monthly visit had become the beginning of a mystery I could no longer walk away from. I stood there long after they disappeared through the cemetery gate, unable to convince myself that I had truly heard what the little boy had whispered. That nickname had never appeared on the headstone. It had never been written in a newspaper or shared during any public memorial. It belonged only to our family, spoken around our dinner table years before silence became the loudest sound in my life. I slowly walked toward the gate, hoping to catch up with them, but the quiet country road beyond the cemetery was already empty except for leaves drifting across the pavement. The unanswered question followed me home. That evening I sat alone inside the library of my estate, surrounded by shelves of books that no longer held my attention. I replayed every second of the morning in my mind. The waitress had shown no sign of pretending to know me. Her apology had been sincere. The child had looked at my son's grave with affection rather than curiosity. Most of all, the sadness in her eyes had not belonged to a stranger paying a casual visit. It was the grief of someone carrying a memory that refused to fade. The following afternoon I returned to the small family restaurant where my driver quietly told me he had occasionally seen the young waitress working. I chose a table near the window and waited without introducing myself. A few minutes later she approached carrying a coffee pot and a gentle smile that disappeared the instant she recognized me. She greeted me politely, but I could see uncertainty behind her calm expression. Before she could leave, I quietly asked whether we could speak for a few minutes after her shift ended. She looked toward the little boy coloring with crayons in a booth near the counter before answering with a small nod. An hour later we sat on a wooden bench outside the restaurant beneath the warm light of the setting sun. The child remained nearby, happily folding paper birds from a stack of napkins. I thanked her for caring for my son's grave, then gently asked the question that had echoed through my thoughts since morning. How did he know that nickname? She lowered her eyes and held the edge of her paper cup with both hands. For several moments only the distant sound of passing cars filled the silence. Finally she looked back at me, tears gathering once again. I never wanted you to learn the truth this way, she whispered. Before I could ask another question, the little boy ran toward us holding one carefully folded paper bird. He placed it into my hand with a bright smile and said, "Mom says someone kind taught her how to make those a long time ago." I looked at the paper bird resting in my palm, and something deep inside me stirred because my son had folded hundreds of those very same birds, and suddenly I understood that the answers I had searched for were waiting somewhere inside a forgotten chapter of his life. The paper bird remained in my hand long after Grace and Noah returned inside the restaurant. Its folds were simple, careful, and unmistakably familiar. My son had loved making those tiny birds whenever he believed someone needed encouragement more than words. He used to leave them on library tables, hospital waiting room chairs, and park benches with short handwritten messages tucked inside. Standing beneath the fading evening sky, I suddenly remembered something I had not thought about in years. During his final year, he often volunteered without telling anyone where he had gone. He would simply smile and say that kindness worked best when nobody expected applause. The next morning I returned to the restaurant carrying one of the paper birds my son had folded years earlier, preserved inside a small keepsake box at home. Grace noticed it immediately. Her eyes widened, and for a brief moment she forgot to hide the emotions she had been carrying for so long. After her shift ended, she quietly invited me to a modest apartment on the edge of town. The home was small but filled with warmth. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator. Fresh flowers rested on the kitchen table inside an old glass jar. Books lined a wooden shelf beside neatly folded blankets. It was not an expensive home, but it was filled with care. Grace disappeared into her bedroom for a moment before returning with a worn wooden box wrapped inside a faded blue cloth. She placed it gently between us without speaking. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside rested dozens of carefully preserved paper birds, each protected as though it were priceless. Beneath them lay several handwritten notes, a friendship bracelet woven from blue and white thread, and a small sketchbook filled with cheerful drawings. I immediately recognized the handwriting. Every letter belonged to my son. My hands trembled as I opened the first folded note. It read, "If today feels heavy, carry one small hope until tomorrow arrives." Another message simply said, "Kindness grows when someone chooses to pass it forward." Grace watched quietly as tears blurred my vision. Finally she spoke in a soft voice. "He met me when I was 16. I was frightened, alone, and trying to believe life could become better. He never treated me like someone who needed saving. He treated me like someone who already mattered." Noah climbed onto the chair beside me, gently touching one of the paper birds with careful fingers. "Mom says they remind people to keep smiling," he said proudly. I looked around the little apartment and realized these fragile paper birds had carried my son's kindness farther than I had ever imagined. Then Grace reached into the bottom of the wooden box and slowly removed a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly. I had buried my son 5 years earlier, yet somehow a letter from him had just found its way back into my hands. For several minutes I simply stared at the unopened envelope resting in my hands. The paper had faded slightly with time, yet the handwriting remained unmistakable. My son had written my name with the same careful lettering he used on birthday cards and little notes he left around the house whenever he wanted to make someone smile. My heart raced as I gently broke the seal. Grace remained silent across the table while Noah quietly continued folding another paper bird beside the window. The room was filled only with the soft ticking of a small clock and the distant sounds of children playing outside. I unfolded the letter with trembling hands and slowly began to read. "Dad, if you are reading this one day, it means Grace finally believed she was strong enough to share our story. Please do not be upset that I asked her to wait. Some promises need time before they are ready. I paused, struggling to steady my breathing before continuing. I met Grace during one of my volunteer afternoons. She thought nobody noticed her. I wanted her to know that one kind conversation can change an entire life. If life ever takes me somewhere I cannot return from, promise me you will not let kindness end with me. Please help her if she ever needs someone to remind her she is never alone. I lowered the letter for a moment as tears quietly blurred the words before me. Grace looked toward the window, giving me the privacy to absorb every sentence. After collecting myself, I continued reading. She promised me that if she ever became strong enough, she would help another child find hope. I believe she will keep that promise because she has one of the bravest hearts I have ever known. My eyes slowly lifted from the page to Noah, who smiled proudly after finishing another perfectly folded paper bird. Grace finally spoke in a calm, gentle voice. She explained that after meeting my son years earlier, she had begun volunteering at community centers whenever she had free time, encouraging children who were struggling with loneliness just as she once had. When Noah came into her life through a relative who could no longer care for him, she raised him with the same patience, encouragement, and quiet generosity that my son had shown her. There was no hidden secret about Noah's identity, no forgotten inheritance, and no mystery waiting to overturn the past. The true inheritance had always been kindness passed faithfully from one life to another. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope, realizing that my son had left behind something far greater than memories. He had left behind a purpose, and for the first time in many years I felt that the empty rooms inside my heart were no longer echoing with loss alone but were beginning to fill with hope once again. The following Saturday I returned to Grace's apartment carrying nothing except the wooden box, my son's letter, and a quiet determination that had been missing from my life for years. Grace welcomed me with the same gentle smile that had first caught my attention at the cemetery, while Noah proudly opened the door before I even had a chance to knock. He immediately showed me a small table covered with colorful drawings, folded paper birds, and handwritten thank you cards made by children from the community center where Grace volunteered every weekend. Looking around the modest apartment, I realized that my son's promise had never stopped growing. It had simply continued in a place I had never known existed. Grace prepared coffee while Noah eagerly explained each drawing hanging on the wall. Every picture carried bright colors, hopeful messages, and smiling faces. They all made one paper bird before they went home, Noah said happily. Mom says every bird reminds someone that tomorrow can be better. I smiled because those words sounded exactly like something my son would have believed. After we sat together at the small kitchen table, Grace quietly shared more of the story she had protected for so many years. She explained that after meeting my son, she slowly rebuilt her confidence, finished school, found steady work as a waitress, and dedicated every free hour to helping children who felt forgotten. When Noah entered her life through a close family member who could no longer provide daily care, she welcomed him with the same unconditional kindness she had once received. She never claimed that life had become easy. Instead, she chose gratitude over bitterness one ordinary day at a time. Listening to her, I understood that my son's greatest gift had never been money or opportunity. It had been the simple belief that one person could still matter, even during the hardest season of life. Before leaving, I asked whether they would visit my estate the following afternoon. Grace hesitated at first, worried that they might not belong in such a place, but I gently assured her that the invitation came from my heart rather than my name or success. The next day Noah stepped into the gardens with wide eyes filled with wonder, immediately running toward the old oak tree where my son had once spent countless afternoons reading books and folding paper birds. Grace walked quietly beside me, taking in the peaceful surroundings without saying a word. As the afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches, Noah carefully hung one tiny paper bird on a low tree limb before smiling proudly. Watching that simple gesture, I realized my estate no longer felt like a monument to everything I had lost. For the first time in years it felt ready to become a place where kindness could continue growing, just as my son had always hoped it would. The weeks that followed became the beginning of a chapter one never expected to live. Every Saturday morning Grace and Noah visited the estate, not because I had invited them out of obligation, but because the house somehow felt complete whenever they walked through its front door. Noah quickly discovered the old reading room where my son had spent countless afternoons surrounded by adventure novels, sketchbooks, and shelves filled with tiny keepsakes collected over the years. Instead of treating those memories as fragile relics, Noah approached them with gentle curiosity and sincere respect. He carefully placed each paper bird back where he had found it and always whispered a quiet thank you before leaving the room. Watching him, I realized that he was not replacing the son I had lost. He was honoring the kindness my son had left behind. One peaceful afternoon Grace and I walked through the gardens while Noah chased butterflies across the wide green lawn with joyful laughter echoing beneath the old maple trees. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt peaceful. Grace finally admitted that she had almost thrown away the wooden box many years earlier because she believed the memories inside belonged only to the past. Then I remembered what he told me, she said softly. He said that kindness only survives when someone chooses to carry it forward. I smiled as the warm afternoon sunlight reflected across the garden fountain. He was right, I answered quietly. I spent years protecting my memories instead of sharing them. Later that evening I invited Grace and Noah to stay for dinner. The long dining table that once felt far too large for one person now held simple homemade dishes instead of formal meals prepared for business guests. Noah proudly placed 3 folded paper birds in the center of the table before everyone sat down. One for him, he said while pointing toward a framed family photograph resting on the nearby shelf. One for you. One for Mom. Grace gently squeezed his hand, and for a brief moment none of us spoke because every heart at the table understood exactly what those little paper birds represented. After dinner I walked into my study and opened a cabinet that had remained locked since my son's passing. Inside were notebooks filled with his volunteer ideas, handwritten plans for helping children, and sketches for community projects he had dreamed of creating one day. I carried the notebooks back into the living room and placed them carefully before Grace. These were his unfinished dreams, I said. I cannot think of anyone who understands them better than you. Grace looked at the notebooks with quiet emotion before lifting her eyes toward mine. Neither of us knew exactly where those pages would lead us, but as Noah happily folded another paper bird beside the fireplace, I felt certain that my son's story was no longer ending with loss. It was quietly beginning again through every life that kindness continued to touch. The notebooks became part of our weekly routine. Every Saturday afternoon Grace and I spread their pages across the long library table while Noah sat nearby folding paper birds and coloring cheerful illustrations beside each idea he liked the most. Some pages described simple reading circles for children. Others suggested community gardens where families could spend time together after school. None of the dreams required extraordinary wealth. They simply required people willing to care. As we read through every handwritten page, I began to understand my son in ways I never had while he was alive. I had always admired his generous heart, but I had been too busy building companies to notice how quietly he had already begun building hope for others. One crisp autumn morning we visited the neighborhood community center where Grace had volunteered for years. The building was modest, with bright murals painted by local children and shelves filled with donated books. The director welcomed us warmly and smiled as Noah ran inside carrying a small basket filled with folded paper birds. Within minutes children gathered around him, laughing as he patiently showed them how to fold their own. Grace joined them naturally, encouraging every child with the same gentle voice that had first comforted her years earlier. I stood in the doorway watching the room come alive, realizing that none of the children cared who owned successful companies or impressive buildings. They responded to kindness, attention, and genuine presence. Later that afternoon I quietly announced that our family foundation would renovate the community center and create a scholarship program inspired by my son's notebooks. Grace immediately shook her head with a modest smile. "Please do not make it about his name alone," she said softly. He always believed kindness belonged to everyone. Her words reminded me of the letter resting safely inside my desk drawer. I nodded and answered, "Then we will make it about every child who needs someone to believe in them." Noah looked up from his paper birds with bright excitement. "Can we still teach everyone how to fold these?" he asked. Grace laughed gently before looking toward me. "That might become the most important lesson of all." We spent the rest of the afternoon hanging colorful paper birds across the windows while children wrote hopeful messages inside each one. As evening sunlight filled the room with warm golden light, I noticed something remarkable. The same quiet joy I had once seen only in my son's smile now appeared on dozens of young faces. Walking back toward the car beside Grace and Noah, I realized that grief had not disappeared from my life. It had simply learned to walk beside gratitude instead of loneliness, and for the first time I truly believed that the future my son had imagined was no longer waiting inside forgotten notebooks. It was already unfolding one kind heart at a time. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, the community center became more than a place where children gathered after school. It became a second home for families searching for hope, encouragement, and simple reminders that they were never alone. Every Saturday morning Grace welcomed each child by name before handing them colorful paper and showing them how to fold another paper bird. Noah proudly helped the younger children, celebrating every imperfect fold as though it were a masterpiece. I often arrived early just to watch them before anyone noticed I was standing near the doorway. Their laughter carried the same quiet warmth that had once filled my own home years ago. One snowy evening, after the last family had returned home, Grace and I remained behind to tidy the tables while Noah slept peacefully beneath a warm blanket on a nearby couch. Soft lights reflected across the windows as snowflakes drifted silently outside. We worked without speaking for several minutes because the silence between us had become comfortable rather than uncertain. Finally I placed one of my son's notebooks gently onto the table beside her. "He trusted you long before I ever had the chance," I said quietly. Grace rested her hand on the worn cover before answering with a gentle smile. "He believed people deserved another chance, even when they could not see it themselves." I looked around the room filled with children's drawings, paper birds, and handwritten messages of gratitude. "You gave his dream a future," I replied. She slowly shook her head. "We all did. He planted the first seed. We simply chose not to let it disappear." Her words settled gently into my heart. For years I had believed healing meant learning how to forget the pain. Grace had shown me something entirely different. Healing meant allowing love to continue growing without asking grief to leave first. As we prepared to lock the building, Noah woke and quietly walked toward us carrying 3 paper birds he had folded before falling asleep. He smiled and handed one to Grace, one to me, and kept the last one for himself. "Families should always match," he said with complete sincerity. Grace and I exchanged a quiet smile before walking outside together beneath the softly falling snow. Noah slipped one small hand into hers and the other into mine without hesitation. No promises were spoken. No grand declarations interrupted the peaceful evening. Yet in that ordinary walk toward the parking lot, I realized that somewhere between shared memories, patient kindness, and countless paper birds, the empty spaces inside my life had quietly become filled again. Looking at Grace beneath the gentle glow of the streetlights, I understood that my heart was no longer holding on to the past alone. It had finally found the courage to welcome a future that my son, in his extraordinary wisdom, had somehow begun creating long before any of us realized it. 1 year later the first Saturday of October arrived once again, carrying the same cool breeze, the same golden leaves, and the same quiet path leading through the cemetery. Yet everything inside my heart had changed. I no longer walked alone. Grace stood beside me with peaceful confidence, while Noah skipped a few steps ahead carrying a bouquet of white lilies in one hand and 3 carefully folded paper birds in the other. We stopped before my son's grave, where the polished granite reflected the soft morning sunlight just as it had on countless visits before. This time there were no unanswered questions waiting beside the headstone. There was only gratitude. Noah gently placed the flowers on the grass before arranging the paper birds with great care. One rested beside the bouquet. One remained in his own pocket. The third he quietly handed to Grace. With a smile that needed no explanation. We stood together in comfortable silence, allowing the gentle rustling of autumn leaves to say everything words never could. After several peaceful moments, Grace reached into her bag and removed a small photo album filled with pictures from the past year. There were photographs of children laughing inside the community center, families planting flowers together, reading circles beneath the old oak tree, and colorful paper birds hanging across bright classroom windows. Every page reflected the same lesson my son had carried throughout his short life. Kindness never disappears when someone chooses to pass it forward. Noah carefully opened the album to his favorite picture. It showed dozens of children holding paper birds above their heads while smiling toward the camera. "He would have liked this," Noah whispered. I smiled through grateful eyes before answering, "I believe he already does." As we slowly walked away from the grave, I looked back one final time and realized I no longer saw only a place marked by loss. I saw the beginning of every blessing that had quietly entered my life afterward. Grace slipped her hand gently into mine, and this time I held it without hesitation because the future no longer felt like something I needed to fear. It felt like a promise waiting to be lived. Noah ran ahead toward the cemetery gate before turning back with the joyful excitement only a child could carry. "Come on," he called. "We are going to be late. The children are waiting." Grace laughed softly, and together we followed him beneath the golden trees toward another ordinary Saturday filled with hope. As the cemetery faded behind us, I finally understood the greatest gift my son had ever given me. He had not left me with endless sorrow. He had left me a path leading back to life through kindness, courage, and love shared without expecting anything in return. Sometimes the people we miss the most never truly leave us. They simply continue changing the world through the hearts they once touched, one quiet act of kindness at a time.